Crushing the cultural Marxists, breaking the grip of corrupt oligarchs, and taking back our country through America first. Here's your host of Liberty and Reality, John Henson.
Welcome back to the Liberty and Reality podcast. If you've been following me up to this point, we're on episode 5, and I really appreciate you viewing my content, taking the time to listen to my ideas. I will continue on this path. I really enjoy it. If nothing else, it's a personal passion of mine and something I've wanted to do for a long time. And today, we're going to talk about something that's kind of rolled in my brain for a while. Something that's an idea of mine. I don't know if anybody else has thought of this. And so if you've heard of it from somebody else, I didn't steal it. So sometimes great minds just think alike. And it is something that most people don't really think about. This is about what happens when you or one of your loved ones are unlucky enough to find themselves afoul of the law, find themselves in the custody of the state, find themselves with criminal charges. And this concept couldn't be applied today. This is just the system you would find yourself under right now would be very unfair and needs to be fixed. This is my concept for fixing it. And it's, obviously take a while to get there, but I think it's worthwhile. So we're going to talk about it. And I just got to admit up front, my concept is downright socialist. But hear me out. The justice system itself is already socialist. It has to be. Justice system is run by the state. And while we have a constitution that is supposed to regulate and limit the power of the state, it's supposed to afford us protections, as provisions set aside for that, we all know that the actual legal system is a multi-tiered system. It's unfair. It's unfair because it has a price tag attached. We've all seen it. We've all seen a rich actor or politician or somebody from Wall Street or any number of people commit a crime that we would go to jail for years, and they get off. They get a reduced sentence, make a deal. And we can't do that. It's not fair. And I think the system I've come up with here, that'll fix that. And we have to go back through a little bit of history on how we got here. Because the framers, it's not their fault. They were brilliant. But this is not something they could have predicted. At the nation's founding, laws were much different. There were much fewer of them. Much fewer laws and regulations. So criminal justice was also far different. And things were fairly simple if you were an American. If you were unlucky enough to find yourself in trouble, which was pretty hard in those days, there just weren't as many things to find yourself in trouble for. And a lot of the people that found themselves in trouble were, were kind of professional troublemakers, bank robbers and whatnot. Professional outlaws, I guess you could call them. But to track down how things happen today, you got to keep this in mind that people were, for the most part, able to defend themselves in court. They didn't have to go get a lawyer. So the legal profession itself, there were lawyers around, but the legal profession was really decentralized. It was informal. It was just radically different from the corporate machine we have now. And the way the legal system actually operated in the United States, where courts were much faster, they were cheaper, there wasn't a lot of legal jargon or technical legal rules. Many of the judges weren't even legal scholars. A lot of them were, like the magistrates and justices of the peace. They weren't lawyers. They had no no legal experience, but a lot of times they were just respected members of the community. Many times they were community leaders or merchants or farmers that the community they were in had entrusted them with this position as the judge. And they based their rulings on local custom and English common law practices, things that we had inherited from England. The trials themselves rarely lasted more than a few hours or a day. The juries themselves, that's where most of the power actually lie, rather than the judges themselves. And they would often decide the facts of the case, and they frequently decide how the law would be interpreted and how it would be applied to a specific case. So instead of the judge objecting, many times it would be the juries themselves deciding to object or deciding how things would be admitted into evidence. Now, the framers did write the Sixth Amendment, and it did guarantee legal counsel for the defense. That meant people did have the right to retain counsel. That's all it meant. Didn't mean the state would provide it. That's what we have today. So, many times there were cases, especially some of the more serious cases like murder or things like that, where a judge would appoint somebody that didn't have money, an attorney. But those attorneys, they didn't do it for profit. They did it for their civic duty. But for lesser crimes, usually the defendants just defended themselves. They didn't need a lawyer. And because the court procedures, they were straightforward, self-representation was made easy. Now, there was one famous case of this civil duty in American history with John Adams, and this is back before the founding of the country, back in the colonial era. There were British soldiers in Boston that fired on American citizens. Now, this was a time when there was a lot of tension, obviously, before the Revolutionary War. But John Adams took it as a civil duty to defend the British soldiers, and he won. They got off. So that's just an example of how people thought of the legal profession. And John Adams himself was one of the more famous lawyers and legal scholars in the country at that time. Of course, he went on to be president. Now, the concept of a specialized criminal defense attorney or massive corporate firm obviously wasn't even anybody's thoughts at the time of the country's founding. And most of the lawyers, they were just generalists. They read books, they might have some experience. And a lot of times they would handle things like land disputes and wills and maybe debt collection. A lot of it was just financially related. But they would take an occasional criminal case. So really the highest paid lawyers had nothing to do with criminal justice. They were people that were out handling the big trade disputes, things that you would have like in the major maritime hubs where the trade was coming in. Commerce was going through the cities. That's places like Boston and Philadelphia and New York, the major financial hubs. And that's where you did find some elite lawyers, lawyers that did have money. They were rich by the standards of the day, but nothing like what you have today. There weren't any big law firms. A lot of these guys, they just worked by themselves. They would have one room, one office. They might have a couple of apprentices that wanted to be attorneys themselves, and that's how they would work. And that was actually the path to becoming an attorney, was through an apprenticeship. Somebody who knew the law, who had read the law, and rather than going to a formal law school, they would learn from another attorney. And there was no centralized bar exam or anything like that. An aspiring lawyer would pay an established attorney a fee to learn under them. And they would copy documents by hand in the attorney's office, and they would attend court proceedings as well as studying the text that the attorney would have so they could learn. And once a mentor felt his lawyer apprentice was ready, or his prospective lawyer apprentice was ready, they would recommend him to the local judge, the local court. And the local judge would conduct an oral examination. It's not exactly what you would think. It was more of a conversational exam. A lot of time, these exams were held over drinks and held over dinner in the local tavern. The testing candidate's character was evaluated, as well as his political philosophy and his basic legal knowledge. But a lot of it was just relationship based. And if the judges had liked you, you would become a lawyer. That's how it worked. Now, when the framers envisioned justice, they relied on a system of proportionality and simplicity. They weren't trying to make it complicated. Because there were fewer laws and regulations, court procedures were accessible, and citizens could realistically defend their own freedom and liberty without massive financial burden. Now, this two-tiered system that we have today began to take shape later on in the 19th and 20th centuries. A lot of it had to do with industrialization and the wealth that was generated because of industrialization. A lot of it was post-Civil War. And as the corporations grew, the law firms institutionalized to protect the corporations. And that's where you got your high-paying elite legal structures, your elite lawyers. And at the same time, there was a explosion of laws and regulations, really to protect that corporate class, and it made it impossible for the normal system to navigate the courtroom alone. And you have landmark cases later on that attempted to fix that. The 1963 Supreme Court decision, Gideon versus Wainwright, was the thing that mandated the state provide public defenders. And the problem with that is it mandated public defenders be provided, but it didn't mandate the way the state paid for them. So in a lot of cases, you would have a public defender, but there was no apparatus to motivate them to do anything. And so that's where we are now. This state public defender apparatus has created this crisis where the public defender's offices are underfunded and overwhelmed. And you contrast that by somebody with money who gets in trouble and who can afford these big corporate lawyers. And it's not fair. Now, today, I'm sorry, a lot of technical stuff doing these podcasts. Sometimes you have to make some changes with the computer here, and that's where I'm at. All right. I was doing this earlier, and my sound shut down midway, so this is actually my second time recording this episode. So I got a little bit of practice earlier. So today, justice in America is not necessarily about guilt or innocence. It is a direct function of how much money you can afford to pay. And, if you're a billionaire, you're well-connected elite, maybe even a politician, former president, those types of people, you can buy your way out of almost anything because you can hire an army of high-priced corporate lawyers. You can hire private investigators. You can hire forensic experts. You can hire medical experts, whatever you need. You got the money to do it. For the working class person, they're not going to have that. They're going to depend on the public defender, or at the very least, a bargain basement lawyer that is not going to provide any of that. So, if you are poor, you are often forced to rely on the overworked, underfunded public defender who has 20 minutes to read your case, and then they'll push you into a plea deal. That happens all the time. And, there's people out there that are not guilty of a crime. Maybe they're at the wrong place at the wrong time, but they didn't commit a crime, or maybe evidence was manufactured, or maybe the legal system just made a mistake. But they find themselves in these situations where they're given the ultimatum. You can either go to court and risk spending the rest of your life in prison, maybe 20 years in prison or whatever it is. But if you just plead to this lesser charge, maybe you only spend 5 or 6 years in prison or whatever it is, less time. But somebody can actually afford an adequate legal defense in the overcomplicated legal system we have today. They can get off. Get off scot-free. A lot of times, they can come in with their rich corporate lawyer, and the prosecutors will have no choice but to drop the charges. That's not fair. It's bullshit. That is bullshit. It's not how the Constitution was written. That's not how the system is supposed to run. That's how it is. Now, the main reason our criminal justice is the mess it is because the politicians have made just about everything illegal. It's ridiculous. We've over-criminalized our daily lives. We've created thousands of victimless crimes and regulations, and we've done it to fill the prisons because we have a massive prison industrial complex. That's a complex that allows and motivates the politicians to take money from you. That's what they want. If they can prove that they need this money for prisons, they just go out and tax you for it. They don't need those prisons. They just have too many damn laws. They're not going to admit that. They're just going to scare you. Tell you about all the people that are violating the law, all the criminals out there. It bullshit you. And then you have the private prison corporations that are profiting from that and lobbying those politicians. They want to make money. They want to make money. They make money off of you. They make money off of taking your freedoms away. That's the way it works, sadly. That's where we are in this country. Now, right now, the wealthy oligarchs, they don't give a shit because they can always afford to buy their way out of trouble. And I'm going to give you an example of where this happens, where only money can guarantee you your rights. That's with the gun laws. Think about how those laws are passed, applied, and enforced. And those gun laws are essentially a scam to keep poor people, particularly poor minorities, particularly poor people in these inner city communities where there is actually high crime and where law-abiding citizens actually need those guns for protection. It's from keeping them. It's about keeping them from defending themselves. Now, every single gun law in America is based entirely on appeal to emotion arguments. They're not fact-based. The activists who want gun control, want to take your rights away, they've scared you, and they've scared people into passing this gun legislation. It's all bullshit. If you look at the number of people who died in there, it's significant. There's about a little over 40,000 people every year, that die from guns. The vast majority of those are suicide. And consider this is a country of 350 million people. The chances that you're going to be touched by any of this are very low. But take the suicides off the top. Not because it's not important, it's very important. I'm a veteran, very sensitive to veteran suicide. That's not what we're talking about with, quote, gun crime. The next layer you have to eliminate is domestic violence. Once again, it's not that it's not important. It is. It's just not what is pushed by the fearmongers. Fearmongers are pushing somebody going out in the streets, I'm crazy, and just mowing people down randomly. That's not what's happening. It's very rare. So, the next thing you're left with is the drug crimes. the drug gangs shooting each other for territory, for whatever. And finally, you have those crazies that we're talking about. Very rare. A few hundred a year. Maybe. So I guess you can take those drug criminals as well and lump them into this. And maybe you come up with 3,000 or 4,000 of these crimes total. Sounds bad, but they're really isolated to small areas, small communities. Not that it's not sad, but it's a different issue to deal with. It's not gun crime. It's other issues that we have to confront. So these appeal to emotion arguments that are taking your gun rights away. They're not solving the problem. The other problem they're causing, the quote, gun violence, that are being ignored. It's all about control. And these gun laws, the big problem with it is they never penalize the people who can afford to live in like low crime gated communities. Matter of fact, those people, those elites who live in those low crime gated communities, they'll call the cops when they see somebody come from one of those working class communities. That's not for you, that's for them. They also retain private security teams, private armed security teams, by the way, because they do understand the value of guns for defense, just their defense. Or they just go to a place that's gun friendly. Maybe they just want to defend themselves. Maybe they just want to go target shoot. Maybe they just enjoy gun culture. You can't. I'll let you do it. They're going to do it. And, they can also afford to pay the regulatory burden. When there's costly legal hurdles or taxes or whatever it is that keeps you, the common working class person, owning a gun or making it difficult, they don't care. They can buy their way out of that too. So these are supposed to be the constitutional rights that are not infringed. That's what the Second Amendment says. Shall not be infringed. But it's being infringed a lot. So the gun laws, their only purpose is to punish the law-abiding citizen, law-abiding poor people, while affording the rich ways to protect their interests through finances and threat of force. They have the threat of force. But if you want to defend yourself through force, you're not allowed to. You'll go to jail. If you're poor and try to defend your interests the way rich people do, you go to jail for violating any number of gun crimes. Some of them you don't even know exist. Even if you didn't get convicted for a gun crime, maybe you got convicted or arrested for another crime, many of these laws will add to your sentence if you're carrying a gun, just for having a gun. Crazy. Happens a lot. And it just varies from state to state. There are things, if you live in like Illinois or Minnesota, if you go into the neighboring state, Iowa, South Dakota, Missouri, those things are legal. But just because you're in Illinois or Minnesota, you're going to get arrested. Bullshit. And it doesn't do anything to stop crime. Because those states, Missouri, Iowa, South Dakota, are fairly low crime. Except in those areas where guns are regulated the most. So what I'm trying to get to here, and the point is, because this isn't a Second Amendment episode, if you want to truly have your rights, you can only do it if you have the means to defend those rights. And that means that you have to have the means to defend yourself against tyrannical state bureaucrats. If you don't, those rights, sometimes they don't mean shit. It's bullshit. It needs to stop. Everybody needs to have equal legal defense. So to fix this two-tiered system, he came up with a radical idea, something that could force a shift across American society. I propose the complete structural overhaul of the legal system simply by outlawing all private criminal defense attorneys. That means every single criminal defense attorney in the country would become public defenders. They would all work for the government. And when you are charged with a crime, you don't get to use your family's money to buy your way out of it. No more. You don't get to hire a celebrity attorney. Those celebrity attorneys, if they exist, they're going to work for the government. The entire system that determines what attorney you have and how good your attorney is going to be based on a completely blind, randomized lottery. So if you're a homeless person and the lottery falls your way, you may get the preeminent celebrity attorney defending your interests. However, if you're a corrupt Wall Street CEO, you get busted for carrying around a kilo of coke, you might draw the bottom of the barrel attorney, the rookie, the guy who just got out of law school. That's the way the system works. And it's kind of like what the Joker said in The Dark Knight. Great thing about chaos is it's fair. And this system is brutally fair. So to ensure that these state-employed lawyers don't just screw off like most socialists do, there's going to be a free market meritocracy involved. The attorneys are going to be heavily rewarded financially by the state when they win, and only when they win. If they lose, they're going to lose money. They're going to face financial penalties. They may lose their license. There's going to be a motivation to not screw off. There's going to be a motivation to win, something that the current system lacks. Now, why would somebody who's a classical liberal want this? Somebody who despises the power of the state? Well, the ripple effect. The moment the oligarch class realizes they can no longer buy their way out of legal trouble, their entire worldview will change. When that permanent political class, those wealthy elites, realize that they can go to jail, they can face life in prison for an infraction or any time at all, they're going to change their perspective. They're going to understand that lottery is their protections are gone because of it. They may get a crappy attorney. They don't know. Can't buy their way out of trouble anymore. And so they're going to push for a change to the system that benefits all of us, makes it fair for all of us, something that's been lacking. Now, the fear of finding themselves in jail long term will turn those powerful people into hardcore libertarian activists. They will pour billions into lobbying the government to repeal unnecessary laws and victimless crimes. Matter of fact, they may not even have to. The politicians are going to want to do this themselves because it's going to involve them too. They don't want to go to jail either. So the whole system will aggressively move to dismantle the prison industrial complex. They don't want to be sitting in those cells. They don't want to be behind bars either. They will force the state to scale back to the bare minimum required by the Constitution. That's what we all want. So I know most classical liberals, standard libertarians, are going to laugh about this. They're going to call me a commie. That's okay. Think about it. Using this mechanism to smash a state tyranny is actually part of libertarian thought, right out of the playbook. And it's not unprecedented. Milton Friedman, introduced the negative income tax. And he didn't do it because he loved welfare. He hated welfare. But came up with this concept where you can give out state cash. It's pure socialism, but his thinking was entirely tactical. You give out one flat check to everybody, one flat welfare check to everybody, and then it would wipe out the tyrannical welfare bureaucracy. If everybody's getting it, then nobody's getting it. See? That's the way it would work. So there wouldn't be any motivation to cheat. Also, other than the financial side of this, the debate touches on concerns raised by libertarians like Bruce Chapman during the Vietnam era, when we had a draft, last time we had a draft. Now, Chapman opposed military conscription. He opposed war in general. But his motivation was that if we had to have a military, we'd have an all-volunteer force. And he recognized the importance of ensuring that the costs of war were not borne disproportionately by the poor. Okay. He argued that when the political elites can insulate themselves from the draft, they insulate their children from the draft. They faced fewer personal consequences from these foreign interventions, from these wars. You have a universal draft based on a random lottery. Has nothing to do with how much income you have, and you can't get out of it. You can't buy your way out of it. There's no college deferment. You get selected, you're going. Then the influential families would share the risks, and it would create greater public scrutiny from them over our military actions. And this, once again, is going to include the politicians as well. So there would be less motivation to go to war, to send our troops overseas. Now, the My Justice lottery, is what I'll call it here, uses the exact same psychological mechanism as that universal draft was. The moment the oligarchs lose their private legal shield, their own self-preservation will kick in and force them to become the fiercest allies in tearing down the overregulated legal state in America. Now, sometimes to break the corporate state monopoly, you have to turn its weapons against itself. By nationalizing public defense, criminal defense, making it a lottery, we strip those elites of their legal shield and force them to fight alongside the working class, destroy the tyrannical overregulation of American life. And this is all about taking control back for the working class. That's what America First is about. But sometimes you need to give the cultural Marxists a taste of their own medicine. If you want change, that may be the only way to do it. Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching.